The letter arrived the morning I had planned to clear out Mom's study. I didn't expect anyone to interfere. Not her lawyer, not my stepmother, not even the family I had trusted for years. The envelope was thick, embossed, deliberate. My stepmother's eyes followed me the moment I opened it, polite on the surface but sharp beneath. She smiled as if she already knew I wouldn't understand. Inside, the document wasn't a threat. It was a dismantling of everything I believed was mine. Quietly, methodically, my mother's lawyer had rewritten the rules that my stepmother claimed were hers to enforce. And in that calm office, I realized everyone around me had been lying, hiding, waiting. I woke before dawn, as I always did. The house was quiet, still cloaked in the dim blue of morning, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded louder than it ever should. Mom's old coffee maker gurgled to life on the counter, its steady rhythm familiar, grounding. I poured my coffee slowly, listening to the tiny sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards as I moved, the soft scratch of the pen on paper as I updated my journal. Everything was precise, predictable. I liked it that way. Control, even over small routines, felt like armor. Mom's study was my sanctuary, even after her death. The smell of old paper, polished wood, and leather-bound books reminded me that she had trusted me, that in the quiet moments I had inherited not just belongings but confidence in her judgment. My stepmother was polite in passing, asking about trivial matters, a meeting, a grocery list, but she never lingered. I didn't notice the subtle tightening of her jaw or the brief glance at my papers. At that time, I didn't read people well. I believed in trust, in the order of things. Even family gatherings felt structured, rehearsed in a way I had come to expect. We ate dinner at the same table, in the same seats, the conversation looping gently around work, weather, polite updates. My stepmother smiled often, directing questions at others but rarely at me, as if acknowledging my presence only when necessary. I sat quietly, listening, noting the words, gestures, patterns. No one noticed the way I observed. It was easier that way. Being underestimated kept the chaos at a distance. At the office, I carried the same quiet discipline. I filed documents meticulously, answered emails in precise language, and rarely argued when my recommendations were ignored. Colleagues overlooked me, assuming my calm demeanor meant passivity. I knew it was perception, not truth, but I let it be. Observation carried its own power. I noticed discrepancies in schedules, small errors in budgets, inconsistencies in memos. I cataloged them silently. I never spoke of them unless forced. It was not weakness. It was strategy I had inherited from watching Mom navigate a household and family steeped in expectation and hierarchy. Even my personal life reflected the same restraint. Friends were few, carefully chosen. I kept confidences, never shared vulnerabilities lightly. There was a rhythm to my days: coffee, work, small errands, dinner at home, reading, journal. Predictable, contained. And yet, in that contained life, I felt secure. I trusted the patterns, the routines, the systems. I trusted my own judgment. That trust would become a fragile armor in the weeks to come, as I would discover that the world around me was not as I believed it to be. The trust I carried was quiet, almost invisible. I had learned that in families like mine, loud displays of confidence drew attention, sometimes envy. So I stayed in the background, noting gestures, listening to tones, tracking actions. I cataloged the small inconsistencies without judgment, believing naively that people were who they appeared to be. My stepmother smiled politely, offered tea, complimented my efficiency. But I noticed how her eyes flicked toward the locked drawer in Mom's desk, the way her hand lingered over the papers I left untouched. I wrote it down quietly. I didn't confront, didn't question. That was not my way. Observation was enough. By the end of the week, the routines persisted. The same coffee, the same quiet mornings, the same polite smiles. And yet, even as I settled into this normal world, I felt a faint unease, subtle, almost imperceptible. I couldn't name it yet. It was buried beneath the rhythm of my life, a shadow in the corners I did not attend to. Trust was my foundation, but the foundation had already begun to shift. The first subtle moments of unease came like whispers, almost imperceptible, slipping through the familiar patterns of my days. It began with small things: a misplaced document, a folder slightly askew on Mom's desk, one of her letters left open where it shouldn't have been. At first, I dismissed it as absent-mindedness, a flaw in my own memory. But each morning, the anomalies accumulated. A pen I never used appeared on my writing table. A notebook I was certain I had locked the previous night sat slightly open, its spine bent in a way that suggested it had been handled. My stepmother's presence, once distant, became heavier in these moments. She offered small comments, polite and inconspicuous, that carried an odd undertone. "Are you sure you need that file?" she would ask, her voice soft, almost casual, as if questioning my judgment. Or, "Mom would have preferred it this way," though I could not recall Mom ever saying so. At the time, I wrote it off as concern, or perhaps an attempt to be helpful. Trust made me blind to the subtle edges of manipulation. Even my colleagues noticed nothing, and I said nothing. In the office, emails were slightly altered after I sent them, approvals delayed for reasons unexplained. I found one message marked urgent in my inbox, addressed to me, with information I had already reviewed. A small error, easily corrected, yet the repetition of these minor inconsistencies began to weigh. I cataloged them silently, as I always did, without drawing attention. There was a quiet discomfort in knowing that someone had accessed my work without acknowledgement, but my restraint kept me from confronting them. At home, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were almost too faint to articulate. Dinner conversations were polite, yet carried undercurrents of tension I could not name. My stepmother commented on trivial matters in a manner that suggested observation rather than casual concern. "I thought you preferred the blue napkins," she said one evening, her smile measured, her tone even. I remembered nothing about such a preference. It was a small thing, yet it seeded doubt in my environment, in her intentions, in what I thought was normal. The household staff, who had known Mom for years, began to act differently around me. They offered information too late, glanced at each other when I asked questions, hesitated before answering. Nothing concrete, nothing overt, yet enough to make the familiar walls feel narrower, as if my stepmother's careful control was extending through the house in unseen threads. I did not accuse anyone, did not probe, only recorded the discrepancies silently in my mind. It was habit, and habit was my shield. Even the simplest actions carried subtle signals. A drawer left unlocked, a book shifted from its place, a phone screen angled away as I approached. None of it seemed significant alone, yet together they suggested surveillance, quiet intrusion. I felt the first trace of vulnerability, a flicker of unease that contradicted my belief in the stability of my life. I trusted routines, and yet the routines themselves had begun to twist, reshaped by someone else's design. And still, I stayed silent. I relied on the pattern of observation that had always served me. I cataloged, noted, and waited. The quiet discomfort was like a low hum under the normal rhythm of my life, noticeable, but tolerable, easily dismissed if I chose to ignore it. For a while, I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of expectation, that my stepmother's interference was coincidental, that my world was still safe. But deep beneath that calm, I felt the first stirrings of mistrust, fragile and unformed. I could not yet name it, could not yet confront it. Yet it had taken root, a seed of unease that would grow steadily in the weeks to come. And in that quiet tension, I began to realize that the world I trusted, the patterns I relied on, might no longer be mine to control. The anomalies became impossible to ignore. They no longer arrived as whispers. They were deliberate, precise, and frequent enough that dismissing them was no longer an option. It began with the documents. A will, a trust statement, a series of letters, all of them slightly altered, refiled in places I would never have chosen. At first glance, nothing appeared missing, but the pattern was unmistakable. Lines crossed out, dates changed, signatures slightly shifted. Someone had been working carefully, deliberately, to make me doubt my own memory. My stepmother's behavior grew sharper. Polite comments evolved into subtle assertions. "I've taken care of that for you," she would say, moving papers in a way that left them inaccessible. She knew precisely how far she could manipulate the environment without drawing obvious attention. The smallest gestures, placing a book in a different section, leaving my coffee mug slightly farther from the edge of the table, felt insignificant. Yet I noticed. And noticing made me aware that these small movements were not random. They were calculated, a signal of control I had never anticipated. One evening, I discovered an email draft I had never written, saved in my account, addressed to my lawyer. The language was formal, almost convincing, but it misrepresented my intentions. My pulse quickened as I read and reread it. I had drafted nothing like this. It was a clear, silent intrusion into my personal space. Someone had access, not just to my documents, but to my communications, my intentions, my trust in systems I believed were secure. The subtle manipulations began to surface in conversation. Family members, previously casual in their updates, became careful, measured. They spoke in fragments, avoiding direct answers. I asked a simple question about a legacy gift Mom had mentioned years ago, and the response was a distracted nod, a change of subject, a polite smile that carried nothing but omission. That was when the seed of suspicion fully rooted. They were not careless. They were concealing. My own restraint became both shield and prison. I cataloged these red flags silently, noting times, dates, inconsistencies, and movements. I avoided confrontation, knowing that any visible reaction would alert them to my awareness. Observation was my defense, but the psychological weight was immediate and heavy. Each small deceit chipped away at the baseline of trust I had held for my family, revealing fissures in a structure I had thought solid. Even in routine settings, I felt the tension. Staff hesitated, glanced, and redirected information. My stepmother positioned herself at strategic points in the house during casual visits, always nearby, always watching. I noted the placement of her hands, the angle of her head, the pattern of her gaze. Subtle, careful, deliberate, every detail mattered. It was not chaos, it was control. Then came the contradictions. A verbal agreement from months prior was denied. A personal belonging I was certain of being mine was questioned, almost casually. "Are you sure this belonged to Mom?" my stepmother asked, her tone light but her eyes calculating. The question was simple, yet it carried an accusation I could not answer without proof. And proof was just out of reach, layered beneath systems, witnesses, and files I could not yet access. The realization was suffocating. I could not trust appearances. The people I had relied on, the routines I had mastered, the quiet rules that had governed my life, they were no longer reliable. They were being manipulated, reshaped by someone with patience and precision. My stepmother had already begun to rewrite reality in ways I could see but could not yet challenge. I sat in Mom's study one evening, the weight of observation pressing against my chest. The smell of old paper, once comforting, now carried the faint tang of betrayal. Every folder, every book, every letter was a potential clue, a trace of manipulation. The quiet red flags were no longer subtle, they were warnings. And for the first time, I understood that trust was no longer an asset. It was a vulnerability I could not afford to expose. The tension that had hovered in the corners of my life shifted, growing heavier, more insistent. By now, I could trace the subtle manipulations to deliberate intent. Yet when I attempted to question anything, the response was swift, but quiet, calculated. My stepmother, ever polite, always controlled, dismissed concerns as trivial as misunderstandings on my part. "You're overthinking it," she said one evening as I held a folder of documents I knew had been altered. Her tone was calm, almost soothing, but beneath it was a razor-sharp dismissal. It was not just disbelief, it was a message. You are wrong, and you will believe it. Gaslighting arrived in layers. Conversations were reframed, events recounted differently from my own memory. "Mom never mentioned that," she would assert when I referenced a detail, her voice soft, convincing. "Are you sure you remember correctly?" The phrasing, the cadence, everything was designed to make me doubt myself. Even family members echoed these distortions, intentionally or unconsciously. A sibling might shrug off a missed meeting as my mistake, or recall a conversation in a way that contradicted my experience. The pattern was relentless. I began to notice the tension coiling in my chest, the psychological cost of being systematically undermined. I tried to anchor myself in records, emails, bills, and letters, but the intrusions were everywhere. Drafts were altered, signatures carefully forged, messages moved or deleted. It was meticulous, almost surgical. I held up evidence, asked questions, and was met with polite rejection. "I don't think that's how she meant it," or "I'm sure Mom wouldn't have wanted to involve you in that." Each dismissal was a controlled erasure of truth. Each polite negation weighed heavier than confrontation could. I learned to speak cautiously, to phrase inquiries as questions rather than statements, to avoid triggering the subtle rage beneath the civility. The psychological pressure seeped into ordinary life. At breakfast, my stepmother would recount events differently from the day before, always correcting me, but with a calm smile. It was impossible to fight without appearing unstable, irrational, or ungrateful. The power imbalance was clear. She controlled the narrative, and I was forced into silence, forced into self-doubt. The quiet dominance was suffocating. Even the staff, who had once offered small reassurances, began to mirror the gaslighting. They answered my questions vaguely, redirected my requests, or claimed ignorance when I asked about documents I had handled just days before. The layers of complicity reinforced the isolation. I realized that truth alone was insufficient here. No one would validate it without evidence that could withstand the carefully crafted denials. The home itself became a landscape of uncertainty. Objects moved, papers misplaced, files shifted. I began documenting every detail in a ledger I kept in my room, noting times, dates, and interactions. Even the act of observation had become a silent form of resistance, a record of control I could not confront openly. It was exhausting, isolating, and heavy, but necessary. Each entry reinforced my awareness that I was being actively misled, and that the gaslighting was systematic, not incidental. My own emotional restraint became the only shield. I refused outbursts, refused confrontations that could be twisted against me. I spoke only when necessary, measured every word, and noted every reaction. I felt the weight of betrayal pressing inward, a slow burning fire I could neither release nor ignore. The quiet cost was immense. Sleep came fitfully, focus wavered, and every interaction carried a calculated tension. By the end of these weeks, the world I had known was unraveling in silence. I had trusted routines, patterns, and people. All had been reshaped to serve her control. My stepmother's dominance was quiet, almost invisible to anyone else, yet undeniable in its effect. I could see it in the alignment of documents, the altered messages, the careful erasure of memory. And I understood, finally, that restraint, observation, and quiet endurance were my only tools against the gaslighting that threatened to redefine not just the inheritance, but the reality I had always trusted. It began with small slips, fragments of truth leaking through the carefully constructed facade. A signature slightly off on a financial document, a ledger entry that contradicted a verbal agreement. A voice, low and hurried, from one of the staff admitting, almost accidentally, that something had been moved as requested. I noticed these moments the way one notices a shadow shifting in the corner of a room, brief, fleeting, but enough to ignite a spark of understanding. For the first time, the manipulation that had felt invisible began to take form. I started to trace connections systematically. Emails, letters, legal documents, all were mapped, compared, cross-referenced. I noticed patterns that were too precise to be coincidental. Drafts of agreements I had never authorized had been circulated. Certain files that I knew existed were suddenly marked as archived or misplaced. Each inconsistency pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone had been deliberately controlling access to information, guiding perception, and erasing evidence of my authority. A witness emerged unexpectedly. One of Mom's longtime assistants, normally reticent, allowed a fleeting comment to slip. "I was told to handle this as she wanted, not how you would have." Their eyes darted away immediately, and the moment passed, but the seed had been planted. Confirmation did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly, in a glance, in a voice strained by hesitation. The realization settled in like a slow, heavy weight. The betrayal was not only deliberate but systemic. I spent nights reviewing records, comparing dates, and cross-checking account statements. The more I uncovered, the more extensive the manipulation appeared. My stepmother had not acted alone, or at least, she had coordinated actions with subtle influence over those around her. Documents were preemptively altered, communications intercepted, minor disputes reframed in ways that discredited my perspective. Each discovery felt like a small fracture in the world I had relied on, revealing hidden currents of control and deception. Even small, mundane interactions began to betray the underlying reality. A casual question from a relative carried weight I could now decipher. A glance from a staff member confirmed what had previously only been suspicion. The house itself, once comforting in its familiarity, had become a stage for calculated oversight. Every paper, every placement, every carefully timed conversation was evidence. Observation became research, silence became a shield, yet the exposure was incomplete. Each piece of evidence was suggestive but not conclusive. I could see the manipulation, but proving it beyond dispute was another matter. I documented everything meticulously, cataloging each interaction, each inconsistency, knowing that restraint was crucial. Any misstep could allow the betrayal to go unnoticed, or worse, allow the narrative to be twisted further against me. The psychological weight of partial exposure was immense. I understood the betrayal, felt its depth, yet had no public acknowledgement of it. The power imbalance was undeniable. My stepmother had the resources, the social leverage, and the subtle control of perception. I had only observation, records, and my own measured restraint. But in those measures, there was clarity. I could trace her influence, anticipate her moves, and prepare for the moments when the evidence could no longer be ignored. One evening, I caught her moving papers in Mom's study while pretending to straighten a bookshelf. The gesture was casual, but the intention was deliberate. I recorded it silently, noting the date, time, and placement of the documents. The act was minor, almost invisible, yet it confirmed everything I had suspected. The orchestration was ongoing, relentless, and precise. Every small leak of truth now carried enormous significance. By the end of the week, I realized that the partial exposure had shifted the power balance internally, even if externally everything remained controlled by her. I had evidence, witnesses, and observation. I knew the patterns. And although the confrontation was not yet possible, the clarity brought a strange form of quiet empowerment. I understood the scope of the betrayal. I saw the threads she had woven, and in that understanding, I began to anticipate the unraveling that was slowly approaching. The air shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible at first. The subtle manipulations I had catalogued so carefully now became active threats to the boundaries I had tried to preserve. My stepmother's movements grew sharper, deliberate, almost theatrical in their invisibility. Files I had relied upon were rerouted, important emails disappeared, and casual inquiries that once seemed benign now carried an unmistakable edge. I was no longer dealing with small infractions or omissions. The pattern had escalated into direct interference, and I could feel the tightening of control pressing from every angle. One afternoon, I returned to Mom's study to find the safe unlocked, papers shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Certain documents I had been tracking were missing entirely, replaced with duplicates that contained subtle alterations. It was audacious, precise, and calculated to provoke doubt. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from recognition. She had crossed a threshold. The quiet game had become a confrontation I could not ignore, even if I continued to remain outwardly calm. I began to encounter resistance in every corner of my daily life. Staff, once neutral, now aligned themselves subtly with her agenda. When I asked about missing papers, they hesitated, glanced at each other, and offered vague answers. Every step I took was observed, every request was filtered. Even colleagues I trusted outside the household seemed slightly distant, distracted, as though they had been warned or coerced into compliance. The network of influence extended beyond the walls I considered my domain. The psychological cost became tangible. Sleep was shallow. Nights were filled with the mental retracing of steps, cross-referencing documents, and replaying conversations for subtle clues. I recognized the strategy: control through distortion, disorientation, and the gradual erosion of confidence. Each interaction, carefully staged, was meant to destabilize me without overt confrontation. And yet, the awareness of this manipulation gave me a form of quiet clarity, even as it deepened the emotional burden I carried. One critical moment came when I discovered an accounting ledger with entries that were inconsistent with prior statements. The discrepancies were minor in isolation, but collectively undeniable. Someone had deliberately shifted funds, moved inheritances, and altered records to mask their intentions. The realization was chilling. My stepmother was not simply maneuvering within legal gray areas. She was actively reshaping the financial reality that had been promised to me. The betrayal was no longer a possibility. It was confirmed, methodical, and systemic. Attempts at confrontation met with the same calm, disarming dismissal I had encountered before. "You're mistaken," she said once, her tone measured, eyes serene. But her hands lingered on the papers as she spoke, an unconscious or deliberate assertion of dominance. Her power was quiet, almost invisible to anyone outside the immediate interactions, yet undeniable to me. I remained outwardly restrained, recording every detail, noting every gesture. I could not act yet, but I could observe, and observation in this moment became a weapon of its own. Witnesses began to surface in subtle ways. The assistant who had slipped a comment weeks before now allowed small confirmations. A reference here, a hesitant nod there, never overt, always fleeting. It was enough to reinforce what I already knew. The network of lies, manipulation, and gaslighting was not only real, it was coordinated. The pieces were now visible, even if not fully assembled in public view. The escalation was systemic, precise, and relentless. Every day, the stakes rose. Documents, funds, and communications were actively monitored and controlled. My stepmother adjusted the environment with subtlety that would seem innocuous to anyone else. Moving files, arranging meetings without my knowledge, steering conversations to cast doubt on my competence. I began to map her strategies, anticipating her moves, predicting the patterns. Each misstep on her part created an opportunity to document and record, to prepare for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. And yet, the emotional toll was heavy. Restraint became almost a physical act, a constant tightness in my chest. The betrayal was now unavoidable, the manipulation transparent to me, though hidden from the wider world. Every interaction was a negotiation with invisible forces, every document a battleground, every conversation a test of patience and endurance. By the end of the escalation, I understood something fundamental. The power she wielded was not visible in loud words or grand gestures. It was in the shifting of papers, the framing of narratives, the alignment of allies, the careful erasure of evidence. And I, quietly observant, cataloging every detail, had begun to internalize a counterbalance. The stage had been set. The pieces were in motion. The consequences were inevitable. By now, the weight of clarity had become almost unbearable. I had traced her manipulations, documented the altered documents, tracked the rearrangements of files, and noted every lie and omission. I could see the full scope of her orchestration, the quiet control she exercised over the house, the staff, even extended family. The betrayal was no longer subtle, it was undeniable. Yet, despite this knowledge, I found myself immobilized, not by fear, but by the psychological cost of acting too soon. Every reaction carried risk. Every assertion of authority could be twisted into confirmation of instability. I spent long hours in Mom's study, the scent of aged paper heavy in the air. I reread letters, reviewed account statements, and compared past notes. Each discovery of manipulation was accompanied by a quiet ache, a tension between understanding the betrayal and resisting the impulse to confront it. It was a strange liminality, knowing the truth but being unable to act, restrained by strategy, patience, and necessity. The emotional cost was immense. One evening, my stepmother approached me with her usual calm demeanor, carrying a stack of papers. "I thought it would be easier if I sorted these for you," she said, smiling lightly. I knew exactly what she had done. She had replaced originals with altered versions, a deliberate test of control. My hands clenched around the edge of the desk, but I did not speak. The power imbalance was clear. She could manipulate reality around me, and my only response was observation. The restraint required was exhausting, yet crucial. The moral breaking point was subtle but profound. I recognized that acting impulsively, reacting emotionally, would not restore the truth. It would give her an opportunity to assert dominance further. Justice, I realized, was not one in confrontation here. It was one in patience, in meticulous documentation, in quiet endurance. Every glance, every gesture, every altered document became a signal of her control, and my restraint became the counterweight. Friends and trusted staff noticed the change in me. My demeanor grew more focused, less reactive. They did not understand the full extent of the betrayal, only that I was less easily rattled, more precise in my interactions. That quiet discipline was a form of resistance. I realized that the psychological cost of betrayal was not just emotional, it was moral. I had to navigate the knowledge of deception without losing my own principles. I reviewed the ledger again and again, aligning timelines, noting discrepancies. Each redacted note, each altered signature, each quiet manipulation became a data point, a piece of the broader pattern. The act of observation transformed into strategy. My emotional breaking point was not one of anger or despair. It was the hard-edged acceptance that the world I had trusted had been systematically rewritten around me. And yet, the decision to maintain silence and control over my own actions was an act of power, subtle and invisible. The quiet moments were the hardest. Nights spent reviewing files, mornings observing the subtle shifts in the household, afternoons listening to conversations reframed to discredit me. Each moment carried a psychological toll that was cumulative, heavy, and relentless. Yet through it, I discovered a form of resilience that was both moral and emotional. I understood that the betrayal was total, but my response could remain intact, measured, and deliberate. In those moments, I accepted a profound truth. The world could be manipulated, deceived, and controlled by those who wielded power quietly, and the cost of uncovering it was immense. But endurance, meticulous attention, and restraint were the weapons that remained. The breaking point was not the collapse of trust. It was the recognition that trust had been violated so completely that only my own disciplined silence could preserve my integrity and prepare the stage for consequences. The truth began to assert itself quietly, imperceptibly to anyone else but undeniable to me. It started with the documents I had meticulously tracked over weeks, ledgers, letters, and signed papers that contradicted the narrative my stepmother had been constructing. Small inconsistencies, once subtle, now formed a pattern impossible to ignore. The system itself, the legal files, account records, and witness statements, had begun to speak on its own, revealing the orchestration that had been hidden in plain sight. The first consequence appeared through the lawyer Mom had trusted. He called unexpectedly, requesting a meeting under the guise of routine review. The calm precision of his questions, the careful phrasing of his statements, confirmed what I already knew. My stepmother had overstepped. There was a legal and ethical framework that she could not bypass. I presented my records, copies, dates, emails, observations, and he listened without interruption, absorbing every detail. The weight of validation, quiet but absolute, settled over me. Even the staff began to shift subtly. The assistant who had whispered a hint of truth months before now offered confirmation in private. Certain instructions had been given, documents handled under false pretenses. Their relief at sharing details, even in the shadows, was palpable. It was not vindication I felt. It was recognition that the invisible manipulations had consequences beyond her control. The systems she had attempted to bend now acted independently, revealing the scope of her deception. Family members, too, began to notice anomalies. A casual conversation revealed contradictions in her accounts, small errors in the retelling of events, things she had relied upon to maintain her constructed reality. The subtle cracks widened, unnoticed by her, but observed by me. The carefully managed world she had orchestrated was beginning to crumble, quietly, methodically, under its own weight. Even in public interactions, the consequences were subtle but tangible. Documents she had believed secure were traced. Financial transfers were verified. Signatures compared and authenticated. The networks of oversight she had underestimated, the legal system, trusted witnesses, and my own meticulous records, ensured that the narrative could no longer be controlled entirely by her. Power, I realized, was not in loud declarations, but in the records, the witnesses, and the consequences she could not anticipate. My stepmother's composure began to falter in ways almost imperceptible. A fleeting glance, a pause in speech, a hand hovering over papers she had hoped to control. She attempted small corrections, minor realignments of documents and stories, but the quiet momentum of truth could not be stopped. Every action she took to regain control only confirmed the exposure. Her power, so carefully wielded in silence, was being quietly undermined by the systems and people she had assumed would remain pliant. I did not celebrate, and I did not confront her. The satisfaction was muted, almost internal, a recognition of inevitability rather than triumph. Watching the consequences unfold without spectacle, without speeches, without drama, carried its own weight. Justice, in this instance, did not require victory, it required acknowledgement of fact. The quiet accumulation of evidence, the slow revelation of truth, had shifted the balance. By the end, the world she had attempted to manipulate no longer conformed to her design. Documents were restored, witness accounts aligned with reality, and the financial and legal records reflected the truth she had tried to rewrite. The aftermath was subtle, restrained, yet indisputable. The consequences were not theatrical. They were inevitable, methodical, and absolute in their quietness. The house was quieter than it had been in months. Papers lay untouched, files returned to their rightful places, and the staff moved with a subdued, almost relieved rhythm. My stepmother no longer carried the subtle air of control she had once wielded so effortlessly. She smiled, but it was calculated, restrained, and hollow, a gesture without the dominance it had once implied. I walked through Mom's study, the scent of aged paper and ink settling around me like a memory. Nothing was celebrated. No one acknowledged the truth in overt terms. The inheritance, the altered documents, the whispered manipulations, all had been revealed, yet the exposure remained silent. Power had shifted, not with spectacle, but with quiet inevitability. I did not gloat. I did not confront. My observations, the careful documentation, the patient endurance, it had been enough. Justice, in its most restrained form, had been restored. And yet the emotional cost lingered. Sleepless nights, tension coiled in my chest, the awareness of betrayal that had once occupied every corner of my life. In the calm aftermath, I understood that resolution is rarely loud. It is found in the quiet alignment of truth with reality, in the invisible acknowledgement that deceit cannot endure forever. I moved through the house with the weight of memory and observation, carrying neither celebration nor triumph, only the quiet, heavy recognition that the world had returned, however subtly, to its proper course.